Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a fascinating and, frankly, a pretty disturbing look at the human requirement for connection. And we have to draw a really sharp line right at the start between two very different concepts. We're not talking about, choosing to curl up with a book for a weekend.
Right, that peaceful solitude that can actually relieve stress.
Exactly. That's not what this is about.
And that distinction is just so crucial. When we talk about solitude, we mean voluntary restorative time. But when we talk about isolation, we mean involuntary forced deprivation.
And when being alone is imposed on you.
And when that period is indefinite, the effects take on an entirely different, just a shockingly severe dimension.
So our mission today, looking at this deep stack of sources you brought, is to really map those effects. We're going to do a thorough examination of the physiological, the psychological, and I guess the systemic consequences of forced, prolonged confinement.
Yeah, we need to understand not just what happens, but how the mechanism of harm actually works, and the massive real-world scale of this practice, particularly in correctional facilities across the U.S.
Right.
And here's the initial shock factor, the baseline we have to establish. The symptoms get dramatically more severe and persistent the longer the isolation goes on.
It's not a flat line.
Not at all. When someone is confined for weeks, months, or even years, alone, without any meaningful interaction or tasks, their body and mind don't just cope. They undergo fundamental, lasting structural changes.
Okay, let's unpack that. This journey into the mind under siege. What happens right away? What's the first thing that hits the system?
Well, the immediate response is it's primal.
Primal.
Yeah, the body registers the extreme deprivation, the perceived threat, and that leads to this huge immediate spike in stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
The fight or flight chemicals.
Exactly. And if that deprivation ends quickly, the system can reset. But in forced isolation, this just becomes chronic stress. It sets the entire human system on this relentless high alert.
And to really understand the damage, we first have to appreciate why social contact is so essential for our stability in the first place.
That brings us to a really foundational concept in psychology: social reality testing.
I know you mentioned that in the notes. It sounds a little academic, but it's really a necessary part of just daily life, isn't it? It's like an internal sanity check.
Precisely. We use it constantly without even thinking about it. Think about it. Social interactions are essential because they provide this sounding board to gauge if our own perceptions are rational.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so say you get a really curt email from a colleague. Your first thought might be, oh, they must hate me. They're plotting against me.
Right, the mind just jumps to the worst conclusion.
But then you talk to a friend, and that friend might say, actually, they're just swamped with the deadline. They send short emails when they're stressed.
And that external voice provides the anchor. It confirms or corrects your subjective reality. It pulls you back from the edge.
Without that external anchor, your thoughts have nothing to push against. The sense of identity, of reality itself, it gets threatened. Deprived of that, thoughts just begin to spiral completely unchecked.
So small things become huge conspiracies.
Exactly. Minor discomforts become proof of impending doom. And that leads very quickly to a whole spectrum of severe psychiatric symptoms.
It's not just sadness anymore.
No, it stops being just boredom. We're talking about profound mental health crises, severe depression, debilitating obsessions, acute anxiety, suicidal ideation, and for some, devastating breaks from reality.
Like actual delusions and hallucinations.
Full-blown delusions, yes. And here's where it gets really interesting on a neurological level. This prolonged, chronic state of agitation. It doesn't just feel bad. It causes specific, measurable brain changes.
So these are actual structural injuries.
Yeah, that's right. Injuries that impact the way a person responds to the world long after the isolation is over. We're talking about a fundamental remodeling of the brain.
Specifically, I remember this from the sources, impacting the balance between emotional response and rational control.
Exactly. The two key players are the limbic system, which is our ancient survival alarm, regulating fear and stress.
And the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, which is the CEO of the brain. Reasoning, impulse control, all that.
The hub for moral judgment, planning, and the chronic stress causes the limbic system to become hyperactive. It's just always firing, always sensing threat.
So the fear dial is turned up permanently, like a smoke alarm that's constantly blaring.
That's a great way to put it. And meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the part that should process and silence that alarm, it may actually shrink.
Shrinkage in the part of the brain you need for rational thought. That's profound impairment.
It creates this dangerous, lasting imbalance. I mean, you can think of the PFC like the conductor of an orchestra, right? It coordinates everything. If that conductor shrinks or is just functionally absent, the whole orchestra loses control.
And the brain's balance just shifts.
It shifts dramatically away from thoughtful, rational decision-making toward this ingrained emotional reactivity.
So the confinement itself damages the physical infrastructure a person needs to function rationally, to plan, to control impulses when they get out. That completely undermines the idea of rehabilitation.
It does. The brain defaults to fear and reaction, making the individual much more prone to bouts of anxiety, unpredictable rage, and irrational actions, even in safe environments later on.
Let's pull out from the brain for a moment, because the sources show the physiological toll is just as extensive.
Yeah.
This chronic mental stress, it shows up as severe physical decline.
Oh, it's a full system response. It's driven by that constant flood of cortisol. The body just struggles to maintain basic functions.
What does that look like?
People report a complete loss of their sense of time, trouble sleeping, and these physical discomforts that they mirror anxiety attacks, heart palpitations, intense headaches, dizziness.
And hypersensitivity, right, to light and sound.
A profound hypersensitivity, yes. And the effects are structural, too. The sources point to digestive issues and serious weight loss.
Which is a direct biological link.
It is. Chronic stress diverts all available energy to fight or flight and away from systems like digestion. So you get these severe digestive disorders, poor appetite. It all leads to this noticeable physical decline.
I know the sources mention that some people try to cope. They establish these robust routines, exercise, reading, writing, trying to impose some control.
They do, but those routines can only do so much against such profound biological damage. The body and mind are fighting a mechanism that's designed to break them.
Which brings us to the systemic context. We use terms like solitary confinement or restrictive housing, but what's the official classification here?
The United Nations, human rights organizations, psychiatric experts worldwide, they're all unequivocal.
Which is?
Prolonged forced isolation is classified as torture.
Torture. That's the ultimate condemnation, given the clear evidence of harm. And yet, this is common practice, particularly in the U.S.
The scale is just staggering. In 2019, our sources show over 120,000 U.S. prisoners were in solitary confinement.
120,000.
Yeah, spending 22 to 24 hours a day in these small, mostly windowless cells. The cells are typically about 6 by 9 feet.
That's the size of a parking space.
Roughly, yeah. And that's where they live, eat, and sleep. Indefinitely.
So if the UN classifies it as torture, and we have neurological evidence showing it damages the parts of the brain needed for rationality, why is this still so widespread? What's the justification?
It's largely a holdover from punitive, tough-on-crime policies. There's this belief that it's the only tool to manage high-security individuals or maintain order in overcrowded facilities.
But the history you pointed to in the sources shows how flawed that idea is.
It's one of the most surprising parts of this whole topic. Solitary confinement wasn't originally intended as a punishment, not at all.
It was the opposite, right?
Exactly. It was introduced by Quaker groups in the late 1700s as a humane alternative to corporal punishment, whipping, branding, that kind of thing.
The idea being that isolation would lead to reflection, penitence.
Which is, of course, where we get the name penitentiary. The intent was spiritual betterment. The reality was immediate psychological collapse.
And it was criticized almost immediately.
Right out of the gate, public figures like Charles Dickens toured these facilities in the U.S. and was appalled. He famously called it worse than any torture of the body.
So its use declined for a long time. What brought on the massive comeback?
The resurgence really took off in the 1980s and 90s. Alongside these severe, tough-on-crime laws, the U.S. prison population just skyrocketed.
So facilities became dangerously overcrowded.
And authorities turned to solitary as a quick way to maintain control as protests and violence grew.
But the sources make it very clear that this tool, which is supposedly for the worst of the worst, is grossly misapplied.
Oh, absolutely. Many people are placed in isolation for minor nonviolent infractions. Things that show defiance, not danger.
Like what?
Like talking back to a guard, not returning a food tray on time. And while this is damaging to everyone, it's just devastating for the already vulnerable. Many people enter solitary with pre-existing mental health disorders.
And the practice just exacerbates them.
Terribly. It can often lead to full-blown psychosis within days or weeks.
So if the whole purpose of a correctional system is supposed to be rehabilitation and safe reintegration, This practice is just fundamentally counterproductive.
And you see that tragic result in the lasting effects on those who are released. Studies show that people who experience prolonged solitary are 3 times more likely to show signs of PTSD after they get out.
We can connect that directly back to the brain damage we discussed, the shrunken PFC, that hyperactive limbic system.
Exactly. That structural injury shows up as these huge shifts in personality. Increased anxiety, paranoia in totally normal situations. They struggle to concentrate, to connect with others. It makes getting back to community life incredibly difficult.
There have been some attempts at reform, right? Some states have put limits on it.
They have. Some have restricted its use for people with serious mental illness, for children or pregnant people. Some have adopted time limits, like 15 or 20 days.
But there are loopholes.
There are. The sources say authorities will just relabel the practice as therapeutic diversion or observation status while keeping the person in near total isolation. And the laws aren't always enforced.
So we have a practice classified as torture that causes immense neurological damage contrary to rehabilitation. And as the source material notes, it doesn't even reduce overall prison violence.
Right. It's a mechanism of control that destroys the individual without making the facility or the public any safer.
Which forces you to ask, what does a real alternative look like?
And for that, we can look at international models, particularly Norway. They operate under a completely different philosophy of restorative justice.
And their numbers tell a story right away. They imprison far fewer people per capita.
Right. But crucially, they spend 5 times more per prisoner on accommodations, on meaningful classes, and work release programs. They aren't just managing bodies, they are investing in the person.
The facilities are designed to mimic a community.
A small, supportive community, emphasizing skill building and social responsibility. Isolation is used only in an acute crisis and is heavily regulated.
And that focus on building skills, not breaking the psyche, it has a clear result.
It does. Norway has one of the world's lowest rates of recidivism. That's the return to prison after release. It's around 20% compared to over 60% in the U.S.
It supports the idea that we get better together, not apart.
It really does. Their philosophy recognizes that if you treat people like they will eventually return to society, they're much more likely to return successfully.
This deep dive has just fundamentally redefined that difference between chosen solitude and imposed isolation. The core takeaway here is so clear. Involuntary isolation isn't neutral. It profoundly impairs the brain's ability to reason, remember, and manage stress. It shifts the mind from rational thought to ingrained emotional reactivity.
It's structural damage, not just mental distress.
Exactly.
And that leads to a final provocative thought for you to consider, built entirely from the source material. Given that forced isolation actively impairs the prefrontal cortex, the brain's hub for complex reasoning and moral judgment, what are the long-term societal implications of a practice that produces this structural damage in thousands of individuals who will inevitably be returned to the community?
Right.
If we deliberately damage the rational thinking centers of citizens, what kind of society are we ultimately building?